Good evening. Welcome to this session of the 2020 Postal History Symposium, sponsored by the American Philatelic Society, the American Philatelic Research Library, the Smithsonian's National Postal Museum, and this year by the United States Philatelic Classics Society. I am Scott Tiffany, Librarian and Director of Information Services at the American Philatelic Research Library. Our presenter for this session will be Mark Schwartz, and the title for this presentation is the New York Postmaster Provisional. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Mark Schwartz. Mark was born and raised in the Boston area and received degrees from MIT, Indiana University, and Drexel University. Mark's philatelic collecting interests focus primarily on the postal history of Boston and Essex County, Massachusetts, the New York Postmaster Provisional, and transatlantic mail. He has written numerous articles for the Chronicle of the U.S. Classic Postal Issues, the Collectors Club Philatelist, the American Philatelic Congress Book, the Indian Post, and the Massachusetts Spy. Mark is an accredited philatelic judge and an experienced exhibitor who has won numerous awards for his exhibits, beginning with a gold medal for his very first exhibit, a single frame exhibit, at the Philatelic Show in Boxborough, Massachusetts in 2008, and culminating with the Champion of Champions Award in 2015 for his exhibit titled Boston Postal History to 1851, awarded at the annual APS Stamp Show in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Mark is a member of the American Philatelic Society, the United States Philatelic Classic Society, the Postal History Society, the Carriers and Locals Society, the Collectors Club of New York, and the Greater Philadelphia Stamp and Collectors Club. Mark has also served and is serving as a member of the boards of the American Philatelic Society, the Philatelic Foundation, the U.S. Philatelic Classic Society, the Philadelphia National Stamp Exhibition, and the Institute of Analytical Philately. It is my honor to introduce Mark Schwartz and his presentation titled The New York Postmaster Provisional. Mark?
Thank you, Scott. I almost stopped you halfway through that because I was worried that you were eating into my presentation time. Anyway, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here, capping off what a wonderful week of presentations we've had. And I want to make sure that I thank the American Philatelic Society, the American Philatelic Research Library, the Smithsonian National Postal Museum, and the U.S. Philatelic Classic Society for their support of this week. Without them, this would not have been possible. It's my pleasure tonight to be able to talk to you about the New York Postmaster Provisional Stamp of 1845. It fits right into innovation in philately because it helped link the stampless period to the period of stamps that the federal government issued in 1847. The backstory to the provisional stamp, it can be seen in the pre-1845 era where sending a letter for as little as 40 miles to as more as up to 400 miles was somewhere between 6 and 25 cents a sheet. If you had 2 sheets and you sent them over 400 miles, it was 50 cents. This was at a time when the average worker was only making something less than $1 a day. Now, the letter that you can see on the screen from New York to Providence cost 18 3/4 cents. That's a lot of money in those days. But shortly before that letter was sent, but shortly before we really entertained decreasing the amount of money for the postal rates from the federal government, independent mail sort of forced the issue because they began carrying the mail much more cheaply and putting great pressure on the post office. Instead of 18 3/4 cents, which is what the letter below would have cost from Boston to New York in 1844, it only cost 6 1/4 cents when sent by the American Letter Mail Company. And interestingly, you can see, I don't know if you can see this, but you can in this pencil you see pearl. This tells me that the letter was not only taken to New York by the American Letter Mail, it was delivered to the addressee there, all by the same company. So by March 1845, the federal government realized it was losing the bulk of its revenue, the bulk of its mail up and down the East Coast to the independent mail companies. Hale and Company alone in early 1845 was carrying 50 to 60,000 letters a day. Okay, so what you see here is post July 1st, 1845, 5-cent letter sent from New York, which meant it was under a half an ounce and going less than 300 miles. And a 10-cent letter from New York to Chicago, over 300 miles, but also up to 1/2 ounce. These, by the way, were the typical CDSs you would see on New York letters starting at that point. But where are the stamps? We had reduced rates, tailor-made for the production of stamps, but no stamps. The UK started using stamps in 1840, and Brazil started using them in 1843. But even closer to home, the independent mail companies have begun producing and using stamps in early 1844. This is a letter carried by Hale and Company in April of that year. And you see there are 2 stamps. That means it was the letter weighed between 1/2 ounce and 1 ounce. And this was a letter from Boston to New York. Stamps were sold 20 for $1. So even lower than the 6 1/4 unpaid rate. If you paid for them beforehand, it was only 5 cents a unit. So this really pushed at least some postmasters in taking certain steps. The postmasters from these 11 towns decided independently, I'm pretty sure, that they were going to produce stamps for their customers. They benefited not only the post office because they got their money early, but they made it much more convenient for their customers to mail letters. Now, there are many post offices on this list where the stamps are howling rarities. 1, 2, or a few copies known. A few have some more than that and are collectible, like the Baltimore, Maryland Postmaster Provisionals and the St. Louis Bears. But the New York stamp was much more broadly used. It was not only used throughout the then existing United States, but also to the rest of North America and most of Western Europe, as you can see on the next slide. These red dots indicate every place that we know, based on the current census, that a New York provisional letter was sent to. U.S., we don't see Canada, we don't see Puerto Rico or Mexico, but they were sent to there too, and all those places in Europe. So you could make the case that in the United States, the Postmaster Provisional was the first stamp most of these people had ever seen. It helped get them to recognize the value of stamps, and again, to smooth the path to the 1847s. Now, who was the postmaster who did this? It was Robert Hunter Morris. He was the postmaster of New York from 1845 to 49. He was a politician. He had previously been mayor, and shortly after his postmaster term was ended, he became a New York Supreme Court justice. But he already knew that there was a company called Rodden, Hatch and Wright that was using a die on their currency that they produced for various places like New Orleans that he wanted to see on his stamps. It was this image. This is from the famous portrait painted by Gilbert Stuart. Robert Hunter Morris looked at this. He said, this would be an appropriate and dignified image for the postage stamp I want to use in New York. So that's what Rodden, Hatch and Wright did. They took their master die. The one on the top left is a full master die proof. The others are vignettes that are used on currency. And you can see the one in the middle, that's the vignette that was used on this canal banknote from New Orleans. So they had them produce stamps, and typical in stamp production, they produced die proofs, various types of die proofs, although I'm not sure I've seen any other stamp that has a combination proof like this. Die proofs, plate proofs, trial colors, but of course, as befitting the first president of the United States, Morris wanted his stamp to be in black. And this is the way the sheet looked when it was produced. It was 5 by 8, or a sheet of 40 stamps. Now, when you plate a stamp, you look for little tiny differences from one stamp to another, so you know that it's different. But you also need multiples so that you know which stamp is next to which. Despite that, it took them from 1894 till when they first started till 1921 till they could figure out that this was the format of the sheet that Rodden, Hatch, and Rice produced. They produced a total of less than 150,000, a little over 3,600 panes. They delivered the first of them on July 12th, 1845. Morris put them on sale on Sunday, the 14th. The same day he had ads in the New York newspapers touting the availability of those stamps in his post office. One of the ads was interesting. It told his customers that if they wanted to get their letters up to they were going to Europe, up to Boston to get on the Cunard steamer, the best way to do it was to attach one of his stamps. And because of that, we have a sort of an inverse situation here. There are 15 known covers postmarked on July 15th, which was the recognized first day of use. Only 3 were domestic and 12 were foreign. Highly unusual. When Rodden, Hatch, and Wright produced these stamps, there were various paper varieties. They didn't use a completely consistent grade of paper. The one on the top is a Pelure paper. It's thinner. It's thin enough that you can see most of Washington's. Let me see if I can. Most of Washington's face. In particular, this is probably the one that pops out the most. It's his eye. This one in the middle here, by the way, Pelure paper is not uncommon. It can be found without too much difficulty. But the watermark paper is just the opposite. It is pretty rare. At least at this point, only 6 or so examples are known with this double line watermark that you see later on some of the US stamps. And the one on the bottom is what they call a stitch watermark. It comes from the way the paper is squeezed onto the rollers when it's produced. You can probably see, if you look hard, short vertical lines going up and going from here to here. There are only a relatively small number known. I believe a lot more exist. It's just they're so hard to see. People look at them and don't even notice them. Beyond these paper varieties, we also have pre-printed paper creases that come up on this stamp. I put these arrows here because most of the ones I've seen are very difficult to see. I'm still looking for one that I won't need arrows for people to see, but I haven't found it yet. Anybody out there sees one? Well, please let me know. Most vivid are the colors. Vivid is probably a bad word. Most important, I think, to the collectors of the stamp are the colors of the paper that was used to print the stamps on. For most of the life of the stamp, up until January of 1847, all stamps were printed on a bluish-white paper, and they account for 95% of all stamps known. However, in the last shipment from Rodden, Hatch, and Wright, maybe they knew this was the last shipment, maybe they were trying to get rid of a lot of their stock, but some sheets were on a deeper blue or a battleship gray paper. Now, if you're looking at them on cover with cancellations, it really takes an expert to know one from the other. But if you're fortunate enough, as I was, to have off-cover pairs that you could turn over and scan, you can pretty easily see the difference, especially in the blue, on the one in blue on the right. That definitely has a blue cast. And the one in the middle has to be a darker shade than the one on the left, which is the typical bluish-white paper. Now, the blue paper provisional stamps are pretty scarce. There may be only 50 examples on blue paper that exist. And there are 12 covers in the census on the Glass Society site run by a gentleman named Mark Scheuer, who keeps it up to date quite well. If you want to know anything about the covers of this provisional stamp, you can find it on that website. What I'm showing here is one of two known pairs of the blue paper. You saw the reverse of it on the previous slide. There are four known. They're all ex-Caspary. I'm biased, but I think this is the prettiest one because it is a right-hand margin pair. The one on the bottom is special because while the others are signed with initials, you can see those magenta initials in the other stamps, and I'll talk about initials in a minute. The one on the bottom is unsigned. There are only two unsigned used examples of the provisional. This one came out of Vern Morris's collection about 12 years ago from a Siegel sale. As scarce as the blue paper is, the gray paper is even scarcer. I found records of 25 off-cover gray paper stamps, including two pairs, 3 without an initial, and 7 with the RHM initials, the one of the rarest sets of initials, and 12 recorded covers. But there was one cover that's in my collection that wasn't recorded, so now we have 13. The blue paper is a hard paper and a thick paper. The gray paper is a hard paper, harder than the bluish, but the thickness varies up and down. The cover on this page is the earliest known cover, blue paper cover that we found at this point. The cover on this page is probably one of the nicest gray papers because if you look at it carefully, it's got beautifully even margins. It's a clean cover, and it's struck by the 13-bar grid that was introduced into New York City in November of '46 and used very commonly after that. This is a part of a known correspondence that went to Lakeview, New York, and this one in March of 1847. And you can see, again, a pair of gray paper, one of 3 known pairs, and on the bottom, one of 7 with the uncommon RHM initials. Now, what are the cancels used on the stamp? What are the markings used to cancel the stamp? I'll say it that way because there are some things that ended up canceling the stamp that weren't intended to, but that's how they used them. The great bulk of the, especially early cancels, are manuscript, and 85% of the manuscript cancels are in a typical New York bright blue ink. 5% are in magenta, like the cover shown up at the top, in a really pretty magenta color, and 10% are in black, and that black can vary from a real black to a faded black brown. Certainly less pretty than the magenta, in my opinion, anyway. But there are also hand cancels that we see used on purpose on the New York Provisional or by accident. The one up top left is the curved page of New York, and that was often used purposefully to cancel the stamp. And it's used on the vast majority of provisional covers to indicate, yes, the postage was paid. The one in the top middle is very interesting, and I don't think I realized that until earlier this week. That's the 7-bar grid from Boston. Now, 7-bar grids were not sent out by the post office until the 1847 issue was put out there as well. That was the cancel that was sent to various post offices for the specific purpose of canceling those stamps. But since it wasn't issued until after July 1st of 47, that stamp was actually used after the post office had stopped selling them. So it is a late use stamp. The little 5 on the right could probably come from a number of places. It might be associated with the New York Express Mail cancel. The one in the middle from Queenstown, Upper Canada, was a receiving mark that you can see that there's a blue cancel that was put on in New York. But when it got to Canada, the receiving mark was applied such that it struck the stamp. On the right, the US in octagon was actually used to cancel the stamp. These were stamps that were sent out of, once when they reached New York, they were actually sent by carrier by the US City Dispatch Post to the addressee. You see these on a few letters that come from Washington into New York. There are 40 to 45 covers bearing the New York Provisional that originate from cities outside New York. The bottom cancel is probably the most widely seen. It's that 13-bar grid I was talking about that was introduced in November of 1846. Now, there's one additional cancel that I want to talk about. It's the New York foreign mail cancel with that 5 paid integral to the cancel itself. Now, this you sometimes see this used specifically to cancel the stamp, like the letter above that was sent to France in July of 46. But you also often see it just like you see a CDS in some other place on the letter, with the stamp canceled in a more normal manner. Now, I mentioned before the control initials. These are the hallmark of the provisional. They applied initials in the office, probably shortly before they were going to actually sell the stamps, as a measure against theft. Hopefully, I think they felt that if somehow they started seeing lots of stamps without these initials, they'd be suspicious that they were stolen from the office. Unfortunately, they did sell some stamps before they put the initials on, so that may confuse the situation a bit. The first control markings known were applied on July 7 on stamps that were used on covers 2 days after the first stamps went on sale. July 17, 1845. The one on the top left is the initials of Robert Hunter Morris. These are fairly rare. The group of 3 on the right, they're all the initials of Alonzo Castle Monson, who was the brother-in-law of the postmaster. They weren't all written by the same person. Some were undoubtedly put on by Alonzo Castle Monson, probably the one in the left with all letters connected. The one on the bottom were put on by Marcina Monson Jr., who was the brother of Alonzo Castle Monson. And the one on the top right may have been put on by Alonzo Castle Monson or one of the other clerks in the post office. Now, the one at lower left was also Marcina Monson Jr.'s handwriting and his initials, and that is easily the rarest of all the initials. There are only 3 items with those initials on them. So let me take you through the initials. The RHM initials, there are only 13 covers and less than 25 off-cover stamps. Of the 13 known covers, 6 are on covers from New York City, like the one in the upper left. A really lovely cover that was posted on March 13th, 1846. The one on the lower right is one of 7 known from New Hamburg. I mentioned there were some dropped in post offices outside of New York City and sent to New York City. This particular correspondence, which covers all 7 letters, was written by James Lennox of New York Lennox Library fame. He evidently picked these stamps up at the New York Post Office just before he left for New Hamburg, where he was going to stay until his townhouse in New York was completed. So thus we have some lovely letters from New Hamburg, and I'll show you another one later. When the postmaster issued these stamps, Morris sent letters to other postmasters enclosing a stamp and saying, you might come across this stamp on a letter dropped at your post office. Please consider it unpaid and mark it as such. And when it gets to New York, I'll say, that's my stamp, it's already been paid for, and I'll mark it paid. So in this letter, you see the New Hamburg, New York, September 6th postmark. And on the top right, you see a manuscript 5 representing 5 due. Once it got to New York, the New York Post Office applied the paid cancel, and they were done. Here's one example of the MM Junior initials. There are There's one off-cover copy. There is this one, which is on a front. It's the only pair. This is out of the Farrington collection. And the third is a beautiful single on cover. I wish I had a scan of that, from the Leonard Kapiloff collection, which resides underground in a bank vault in New York City. A number of us are hoping that they get sold within our lifetime, so we have a chance at some of the gems that are in that collection. Back to the ACM initials. This is the most common. The ACM, all connected. You can see in the large enlargement on the left. The A is connected to the C is connected to the M, the hip bone is connected to the knee bone, etc. And this is, as I said, the most common. Here's a nice pair of them on cover, paying the over 300-mile rate from New York to Ann Arbor in March of 1847. Here's the next most common variety, the AC connected, not connected to the M. You can see if you look at the stamp, the enlargement, there's a space between the C and M, and there's no magenta ink between that. This is a similar stamp, an AC connected stamp on a nice letter in January 47 sent to New Haven, Connecticut. Now, oddly enough, we once in a great while find two adjoining stamps where one has one set of initials and the other has a different set. In this case, the AC connected plus M on the left and the AC completely connected on the right. It's hard to imagine how this could have happened unless someone stopped signing and then another person picked up signing. It is possible, I suspect, that they could have been signed by the same person. They just signed it different ways, different times. But I prefer to think the first one is the correct one. There are about 7 to 8 examples known of satennate pairs. When I put this together, I only knew one that was on cover, and you'll see it, I think, in a minute. Now, you might, if you look at my exhibit, which is, you have a link on the APS site to my exhibit, you'll see the cover. But there's a second cover that just popped up within the last several months on a letter containing a pair sent to Trieste, Austria. A wonderful cover, which I was fortunate enough to win in a Seagull auction recently. This is probably the most amazing of the satennate pairs and one of the more amazing Postmaster Provisional pieces. Not only is it vertical, none of the others are. Not only is it unused, none of the others are. But it combines a fully signed piece with a fully unsigned piece. I was sitting next to a friend of mine who was bidding on this at the Seagull auction. You could look up in the air and see money flying around that room because, I was interested in this stamp, but I was outbid within 3 seconds after them opening the bid. I'm not sure where this is right now. I'd love to see it come up for auction so I can have another chance at it, but my guess is even if it does, I won't have much of one. Now, this is the least common of all the ACM initials, A period, C period, M period, sometimes seen without the periods, sometimes seen with periods between some letters, not others. They were probably applied by Varsina Monson Jr., brother of Alonzo, as I said. The earliest known use is July 17th, 1845. Remember, that's 2 days after the stamps were first used on a letter. And this copy is interesting, not because it was sent on September 15th, 45, but for two other things. One, it's in the top middle of the cover. You almost always see them at top right or top left. And the other is because it has a street address. Now, this is a street address in Philadelphia. Philadelphia did have a carrier service at that point, and the presence of a street address probably told the postmaster in Philadelphia that he wanted to have the letter delivered. And I think at that time, Philadelphia was probably charging 2 cents for delivery. So now let me show you, I've shown you the basics, the colors, the markings, most importantly, the initials. Let me show you what I consider a few interesting covers in the New York Provisional, Postmaster Provisional period. Remember I said there were a number of earliest known uses. I actually think I have an error here. I think there are 12 foreign and 3 domestic. The one on the upper left is one of only 3 known, and this one goes to Philadelphia. It's lovely not only because it's a first day, but because they took care not to scratch out the portrait of George Washington on the stamp. It's also interesting because, like the last one I showed you, this has a street address. So I think it's John Cadwallader, Esquire. And as such, I believe it was delivered. Now, the one on the right, I'll talk about this more a little later, but this is one of, out of the 12 known to foreign countries, 3 were sent to Germany. This is one of those 3. Now, many of you, I assume, know about the Philadelphia R, which is one of the early registration marks in philately. It was put on incoming covers, not outgoing, incoming covers into Philadelphia. The earliest are there are about 5 known on November 1st, 1845. They're considered the earliest. But on provisionals, there are only 7 examples known. And this is a particularly nice one, because if you look carefully at the stamp, what you see is on the right and the bottom, it's huge margins. So this is a corner margin copy. Obviously, lovely to see something like that on cover. There are lots of railroad covers in New York Provisionals. There are 4 known on the railroad that traveled on the railroad from New York to Philadelphia. You can pick them up because they have the route agent marks of the New York Philadelphia route agent. They are seen in that sort of light blue. You can see the New York on the one on the left. You see an N on the one on the right. It's the same blue that was used for the due mark, the 5 and 10-cent due marks at Philadelphia. The one on the left was a 1/2 ounce letter, accepted as paid at the Philadelphia, and because there was no due mark or no indication that any more was due. The one on the right, we believe this represents a 1 to 1.5 ounce letter with a 5-cent stamp accepted and 2 5-cent due marks indicating triple weight letter. The one on the left, February 5th, was sent after a route agent had been assigned to the train itself, so the marks were applied on the train. The one on the right was before the route agent was signed, so the markings were probably not put on until they reached Philadelphia. Here's a lovely cover that was sent along the Long Island Railroad. It's the only one known. And the interesting part about this railroad, because besides the fact that it was unique, by the way, if you notice the handwriting, this is the handwriting of James Lennox. So even though I don't have contents, I can say that it was addressed from him. But this traveled through the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel, built only a couple years earlier, which is the world's oldest subway tunnel. And then it reached the Long Island Railroad, traveling along it to Greenport, Rhode Island, and from there by the steamboats that plied Long Island Sound to the railroad lines in either Connecticut or possibly Rhode Island, and went up the Providence Boston Railroad line up to Boston, to which it was addressed. Something I think even less common, well, not less common than Long Island, but less common than most, is a New York and Erie Railroad cover. There are only 3 covers with this CDS known. They were all sent from New York to Ramapo Works, New York. All have the CDS, the paid, and if you look closely on the upper right, you see a faint 5. This is interesting because it was sent up the Hudson River from New York to Piermont, New York, got off there, and where the New York and Erie Railroad starts, and it went to Ramapo Works from there. As I said, all three covers that are known went to Ramapo Works, New York. This one in June of what we think is 1846. This bears a CDS that's probably more familiar to you. This is the New York Express Mail marking. The Express Mail was not really express. If you missed being able to bring it to the post office, or it was more convenient, you could bring it to the train. Whether you brought it to the post office or to the train, it got on the train. But this one did not go through the post office. It went directly to the train, was marked with the New York Express Mail marking on September 1st, 1845, and marked paid and sent up to Bolton, Mass. There's only 7 known covers bearing the U.S. Express Mail marking. 3 are to foreign destinations. I'm still looking for one of those for my collection. Now, these are among the rarest of all Postmaster Provisional covers. Those used concomitantly with a local or carrier. There are only 2 known used concomitantly with a Boyd's carrier. A Boyd's local. This is an intact cover, a full cover, sent on June 19th, again, probably 1846, to Washington, D.C. There's another one that is on a cover front. There are also 2 covers recorded with a 3-cent U.S. City Dispatch post stamp. You can see it here. This is what I consider a phenomenal cover. Both covers that have both a provisional and a U.S. City Dispatch post are incredible covers. This one, because like the other one, it was sent from New Hamburg, from Lenox. The stamp was marked with the RHM initials, and it contains a City Dispatch post stamp, which means once it got to New York, it was delivered to the Sun Mutual Insurance Company on Wall Street. You can see the New Hamburg postmark, top left, the 5-cent due mark, and the paid once it got into DC. By the way, the other one may only be on a front, but that went to the Netherlands. So another amazing cover. You can see an image of that on the Classic Society census site if you want. Now, I mentioned earlier that there were some covers sent from outside New York City into New York City. Somewhere 40, 45 of them or so. Half of those were sent from Boston. Most of those by an agent of Holland and Aspinwall that used to go back and forth between Boston and New York. He probably purchased a group of stamps in New York and took them with him on his trip, so it was easier for him to send mail back into Boston. Unfortunately for collectors, most of those covers that went from Boston to New York had their address panels cut out. This was a custom back then. I'm not sure why, but it frustrates a lot of collectors. I was lucky enough to get this cover from the collector. Some of you may know him, Harvey Mirsky. And it's an intact cover. I like it, but it was just happenstance that the CDS also cancels the stamp. And then you see the magenta 5 due on the right. And then once it got to New York, it was marked paid. The one on the lower right, I think, is even more amazing. It's from Philadelphia. It's one of only 2 known from Philadelphia sent to New York. And this was sent in May of 1846. The other one, I wish I'd shown it to you here, but I don't want to take too much time. It's a pair on a cover from Philadelphia through New York to Canada. One of the iconic covers in New York provisional postal history. This is another one. Another Boston cover from Holland and Aspinwall, so it's the same handwriting. But this is a triple weight cover. Not only is it triple weight, but if you look carefully at the stamps, you'll note that the single stamp at right is uninitialed. And the pair of stamps at left, while initialed, are vertical and are a bottom left sheet margin copy. So if you take that Philadelphia and this Boston cover, you have the most iconic of the non-New York originating covers in the provisional era. Now, there are very few known items sent into New York with provisionals from more than 300 miles away. Essentially everything else that was sent into New York with a provisional was in that 300-mile range and said one stamp. This one is the only one known sent from Charleston, South Carolina, with a pair of stamps marked with that big Charleston 10, indicating that the postage was due when it got to New York. Well, the postage had been paid. The New York Postmaster recognized that, marked it paid, and then canceled the two provisionals with the New York 13-bar grid. But there is another item known from outside New York. It's an off-cover stamp, and if you look carefully at the marking, you will see a Savannah, Georgia Integral 10 CDS. Now, the only way they're going to put an Integral 10 CDS on a provisional is if they're doing it on a pair of provisionals on cover from Savannah. So that makes at least two items that were sent in from more than 300 miles away. There's some wonderful multiples. There are 4 known strips of 4. 2 of them are in the Era van Houb collection. Gee, once you have one of them, I don't know why you need another one. But I'm waiting to see if any of those come up in the Houb sales. They've had, I think, 3 Houb sales. It hasn't. I don't think it's coming up this time. But I wasn't going to wait. I was able to get this a couple of years ago for my own. This is a double weight letter traveling over 300 miles in June of 1846 from New York to Marietta, Ohio. This is an even more interesting cover. It's an irregular block of 6, paying the triple rate to Buffalo. Now, an even more amazing part is if I had shown you what this block of 6 looked like before it was fixed, you wouldn't believe it. There were pieces missing from maybe half the stamps. Whoever did the restoration, and it was done way before I got it, was an artist. You can look at it under glass. It's very, very difficult to see any restoration whatsoever. But of course, if you show it in an exhibit, you better let the judges know. And this one blows your socks off. This is the most iconic item in New York Postmaster Provisional history. It's a 6 times rate cover sent over 300 miles to Ogdensburg, New York. Called the Hasbro cover after the addressee Louis Hasbrook, Esquire. This was originally a block of 12, which unfortunately they had to cut apart to fit them on the envelope. Again, this resides somewhere in underground New York in a bank vault controlled by the Kapiloff family. Now, I mentioned foreign mail, and I showed you all these countries that foreign mail was known to have gone through. There are maybe 8 covers known to Canada. I really need to recheck the census because another Canadian cover might have snuck in since I've looked. But this is not only a pretty cover, sent in January of 47, it's unusual in the fact that it has a 3D mark for ferriage when the normal ferriage rate was 2D. And it has a 3D ferriage rate. If you can look at this map here, it was sent from Cape Vincent, New York to Wolfe Island and then sent Wolfe Island to Kingston, Ontario. So not only it went not on one ferry, but 2, thus the extra rate. Here's a cover that was only discovered, only reported a few months ago. It goes to Puerto Rico. They call it St. John's, but it's San Juan. And this was not in our census until it came up in a Siegel sale. I'd say, I don't know, 4 or 5 months ago, the same seal where that Satanic pair to Trieste I mentioned before came. On this cover, the 5-cent pays for the rate from New York to Baltimore, and at Baltimore it takes the brig Francis Jane to Puerto Rico privately. There are many covers that go to or through England in the 30s, but only half of those covers stay in the UK. This cover on the upper left went in 1845 on the Cunard steamer Britannia. The 5-cent stamp paid the rate from New York to Boston to catch the ship. And then when it got to Liverpool, you can see here the hand stamped shilling mark that indicates 1 shilling was paid by the addressee. Now on the bottom right, you see one out of maybe another 17 covers initially addressed to London that were forwarded either undercover or through the post to the Lang, Freeland and Company in Trieste. Like I said, half of them were sent undercover, so there are no rates between the UK and Trieste on them. This one, I'm fortunate enough to have a rate. It's 38 kreuzer. So after James Lang paid the 1 shilling as indicated by that shilling mark, which was later crossed out, the addressee paid 38 kreuzer for a total of French, Swiss, and Austrian postal rates. More covers were sent to and stayed in France than any other country, probably in the early 30s. This one was sent exactly 1 year after the earliest known postmark on a provisional, July 15th, 1846, carried by the Britannia. And in this case, because of the agreement between Britain and France, you didn't have to have somebody receive it in Britain and forward it on. It went directly to the addressee, who paid 21 decimes. 10 went back to Britain for sea post in transit, and 11 stayed in France. Now, the cover on the bottom right was the cover I showed you, was the first day of use, sent to a foreign country, in this case, Germany. This was carried to Liverpool by the Acadia. And again, there was a postal agreement by which it could be sent on without necessity of an interim receiver and forwarder in the UK. When it got to Germany, it was marked 50 kreuzer due for the French and German postal rates. There are 4 covers known sent to Switzerland and 4 to Belgium, 4 full covers. This is what I believe to be, and I'm biased, the prettiest cover sent to Switzerland. Posted in January of *46, carried in the Hibernia. It was sent through France to Switzerland. France and the UK had a second postal agreement in 1843. This was sent under that postal agreement. So it was sent all the way to Switzerland and rated as a 1/4 to 1/2 ounce letter with 46 kreuzer due for the various countries involved. Now, I say 1/4 to 1/2 for those of you who are not familiar. Anything subject to a French agreement, postal agreement, they broke it down into 1/4 ounces, which makes calculating the rates much more difficult than it does for just UK, US. We did it by the 1/2 ounce. So you have 1/0 to 1/4, 1/4 to 1/2, 1/2 to 3/4. It gets very complicated. The one on the bottom right is a nice cover sent to Belgium, posted in October of '45. Again, in this case, marked 1 shilling 8 pence to reach. Because it had to reach the seaport to go by packet to Ostend, Belgium, where it reached Anvers, marked 24 centimes, 20 for the British and 4 for Belgium transit. Now, in July 1847, the need for the New York Provisional pretty much disappeared, and the United States issued its first postage stamps on July 1st, '47, a 5-cent and a 10-cent 47. The 5-cent was a direct substitute for the New York Provisional. This was used February 3rd, around 1850, for the 300-mile rate. And the 10-cent made things a lot more convenient. You didn't have to use 2 stamps or 4 stamps. You could use 1 or 2. The stamp went in June of '50 to New Orleans. I say pretty much ended the provisional period because there are probably about a dozen letters on covers postmarked after July 1st, 1847. In fact, I know of one that was postmarked in January of 1852. So the New York Postal Office, having already sold these stamps, allowed them to be placed in their post office and accepted as such for several years after the new 5 and 10 cent 1847s had been issued. With that, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. What a fascinating to see all these covers in one place. Just remarkable to see some of the Postmaster Provisionals that we've seen tonight. I was curious about the ACM initialing, the control marking,
Right.
and particularly with you mentioned that the brother and the brother-in-law also would sign ACM. How difficult it is to determine forgeries of of those initials?
You know, I'm not really sure, but I am pretty sure that nothing that I've seen has been identified as a forgery. There's nothing on the website, the Clack Society website, and many of these were certified by the Philatelic Foundation. They are the experts, and I think if there were forgeries, they would know it. But it's a good question.
Yeah. How did you get started collecting these? I mean, they're just fascinating to see, but how did you get started with the Provisionals?
Let me back up for one minute.
Yeah, sure.
There aren't known forgeries, but there are known reproductions. I have several pages of those reproductions in my exhibit. The most famous forger, quote unquote forger, was Gene Sperati.
Yes.
He made a number of different stamps. They were not intended to deceive. And that's the difference between a reproduction and a forgery. So we do know that there are some reproductions not made to deceive, but no forgeries have been identified yet. But your question was repeated, please?
How did you get started collecting these?
As many people know, I collected Boston postal history, still collect bits and pieces, different aspects of it. But I had done a lot in that area, and most of it's stampless. And so I thought I would like to put together a collection of a stamp. I looked around and I saw the 47s. Well, Bill Gross collected those. He had almost everything. Harvey Mirsky had a wonderful collection. And one of my best friends, Gordon Eubanks, still has a magnificent collection and continues to improve it to this day. There's no way I was going to compete with any of those folks. So I thought, what about the 51s? Well, there's Gordon again. He won the Grand Prix National in 2016 with his 1851 issue stamp. So that was out. And there were people who collected the 57s. The 69s, which are a very attractive set of stamps, is also being collected. So I thought, well, I won't go forward. Let me go backward. And there were only two major collections of the New York Postmaster Provisional that I knew about. One is Leonard Kapoloff, and he didn't show up very often. And if he did, the last time was a long time ago. And it was a wonderful, wonderful collection. And the other is Jerry Farrington, who was a professor in, I think, North Carolina. And his collection was sold several years ago. I was fortunate enough to meet him at one of the shows several years ago before he passed away. So I thought, I can do this. And so I've spent the last 15 years, I had a few maybe before that, gradually finding more as they come up for auction and adding them to my collection. At this point, I don't think there's another collection out there that is quite as extensive as mine, except maybe the one in the bank in underground New York.
Are there any known covers with the Provisionals and the 1847 issues on them, or was that not allowed?
I think somebody's asked me that. I don't think it's not allowed, but I've never seen one. Yeah. So I have, of course, we do see every once in a great while. And I think there was one in the gross sale this past week where a 47 and a 51 were on the same cover. But I've never seen a combination of a 5 or 10 cent 47 with any provisional, whether it's the New York, the Baltimore, or any of the others. That would be quite something. That would make news.
Yeah. I have a question from one of the attendees. They were struck by the number of stamps in your presentation in which the stamps are frequently placed on the left side of the cover. Do you know when that tradition of putting it on the right side upper corner started?
Well, remember, these were the first stamps most of these people had ever used. And so there were no rules. If you look at the postal laws regarding the 1847 stamps, they not only told you what you had to cancel it with, which was either that 7-bar circular grid that the post office supplied major post office with, or a manuscript X through the cancel. They also told you that it should be affixed in the upper right-hand corner. That was the first time there was any direction as to where the stamp should be affixed. And if you look at the stamps affixed to independent mail covers, they're all over the place.
Do you know, do many copies of the provisional stamps exist off cover? Are they attainable?
Oh yeah, I should have told you this when I told you about how many were produced. I think I said there were about 140,000 produced. The best estimates right now is that currently exist 6,000 copies of the New York Provisional. And of those copies, there are 900 covers. So there are probably 1,000 off-cover stamps. They're not terribly expensive, especially if you don't want them with humongous margins. And they're a nice, I think the first one I got years ago had 2 creases in it. Sold for well less than half catalog.
This is a bit of a lengthy question, but I'll just read it. Several of the covers show New York City addresses. I thought you surmised that the use of the addresses suggested the covers were delivered to the addressees, including a cover to calendar. Why then was a carrier stamp used on one of the calendar covers addressed to Wall Street?
I have to look at the timing of when that New York City Dispatch Post stamp was used. But if it came, don't forget, in order for that to be used, that carrier stamp, it had to be put on by the addressee.
Right.
That was put on by the guy in New Hamburg, who must have gotten them at the same time he got the postage stamps. The other covers, when they came into the post office. There was no reason to put a stamp on them because the New York Post Office would hand them to a carrier for delivery. It wasn't prepaid, it was paid by the addressee when they got the letter.
You showed a cover with a block of 9 on it. What is the number on the lower right corner of the cover with 12 stamps, the block of 9?
Let me go back. That's probably the number indicating the certificate from the PF Foundation. That's a 6-digit number. I could check that. Image might have been pulled into the Classic Society website directly from the PF website. Okay. That might explain why it has the PF certificate number on it.
Someone was asking about a prices realized. What was the auction realization for the vertical pair, one stamp signed and the other unsigned, if you know?
Oh, believe me, I know. I was the guy who bid on it. $70,000, which shows you why I probably wouldn't be getting it if it came up for auction again. Let me make an estimate. If this one comes up for sale, $500,000 to $1 million. And it will probably be purchased by somebody who doesn't collect provisionals.
You've certainly done a lot of research in this area, but are there resources that you would suggest for someone sort of wanted to dive deeper into these?
Oh yeah, Stanley Pillar, if you know, he's a dealer in California. He at one time, I think he still does, specialized among other things in the New York Provisional. He wrote a book. It's a great book. It's a Bible, although there's lots of stuff that exists that we know exists that wasn't in that book. But it's a wonderful book. It contains 90% of all the information you need to know. And the nice part is if you go to the Classic Society website, you don't even have to be a member, although we'd love you to join. You go to the the library, there's a section that contains several books online. You can open up a PDF of his whole book, and you can go through it to your heart's content. The other thing is, in the exhibit section of the Class Society website, you will find not only my exhibit, but you will find Jerry Farrington's original 10-frame exhibit. And I'm trying to think, and that's about it for easily accessible information. There are lots of little pamphlets that were issued, which often contain outdated information, but are great things to look at to see the progression of knowledge. But those, the website and Stanley's book will tell you will give you a huge amount of information.
Thank you. With that answer, I think we will conclude this session of the 2020 Postal History Symposium. For all those joining us for this session, we want to thank you for your attendance and ask that you join us on behalf of the 2020 Postal History Symposium, the American Philatelic Society, the American Philatelic Research Library, the National Postal Museum, and the United States Philatelic Classic Society, and thanking Mark for this wonderful presentation.
And thank everyone else. I hope you enjoyed it.